Good morning, everyone. My name is Shakayla Alvarenga. I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the Mob Museum. Welcome. It is so nice to see so many of you here and as we get back into the swing of things here at the museum. So for the next hour, we will be exploring the fight against organized crime in Canada. And we have a very special guest here. Stephen Metelsky is a criminal psychology professor at Mohawk College in Hamilton, Ontario. He also lectures about organized crime in the Faculty of Arts of Sciences at Queen's University in Kingston. Now, Metelsky was a police sergeant for 21 years before retiring back in 2017. He also specialized in organized crime, informant development, and undercover operations. With that being said, please give Metelsky, who will be joining us via video conference, a round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And it's such an honor to be asked to speak at the Mob Museum. I'm just gonna share my screen and get my PowerPoint up here. And we're gonna start. I'm just gonna hit slideshow. Thank you very much for that introduction. I really appreciate it. I'm going to talk about organized crime in Canada. And the one really cool thing is that, especially down in the United States, New York City is the hub of organized crime, but organized crime in Canada has been historically and right up to present time, very prominent up in Canada. So the three areas I'm going to talk about today, and I'm going to finish with a project that I'm very proud to have been a part of when I finished up my career. We talk about Montreal, Quebec, which has historically been La Cosa Nostra, the Sicilian Mafia in Canada. Toronto, Ontario, really the hub of organized crime for a number of decades, is the Ndrangheta, which is the Calabrian faction. And then Hamilton, Ontario is where I work, and that is historically been Calabrian as well. I'm gonna finish with Project OTremens. It's an RCMP-led project, 4 years, in partnership with the FBI. So I just wanted to show a little map of Canada because, it's really interesting. These three areas, Montreal, Hamilton, and Toronto, you can see where they are here on the map. And the reason why they are such mafia hotbeds is really, a lot of it has to do with their geographic location. They're all very close to waterways. They're very close to the border of the United States of America. Where Hamilton, Ontario is about a 45-minute drive to Buffalo, New York. And Montreal to Toronto is about a 5-hour drive, but a lot of connectivity with these groups into the United States. So in the Mafia, it's really important. I'm gonna give you a little bit of history of the Canadian Mafia, and then we're gonna break it down into these specific areas before we get into talking about the Undercover project involving an international mafia. So the past always dictates the future events, and I call it the trajectory of violence. So whatever has happened in the past is obviously going to dictate the future. And you can look backwards, almost like a piece of the puzzle, especially in Canada, with a lot of the events that have happened. Now, the one big downfall with the mafia in both the United States and Canada is the breakdown of this honor code, this omerta, this secret society. Gone are the days where that has occurred. There's still mobsters that completely adhere to that code. But we know, just by watching the news and reading over the last number of decades, some really high prominent mobsters have turned coat and become cooperating witnesses. And one of these I want to talk about is Joseph Valachi, probably one of the most famous and infamous turncoats. He was a soldier in the Genovese family in New York. And he decided to become an informant or cooperating witness. And back in 1963, he sat down in front of the McClellan Commission, U.S. Senate on Organized Crime. And it was here where really not only organized crime got put on the map, especially with the FBI, but he spoke about two prominent mobsters in Canada, specifically the province of Ontario. He brought up John Papalia and Paul Volpe. And he indicated that these two Canadian mobsters were very connected with the Buffalo Mafia at the time, which was the Stefano Magaddino crime family. So here we have John Papalia on the left and Paul Volpe, those two prominent mobsters who were capos in the Buffalo mob. John Papalia was centered in Hamilton, Ontario, that 45-minute drive down the highway from Buffalo. Paul Volpe was the Toronto representative in the 70s and 80s for Buffalo in the city of Toronto. Now, like everything in the mafia, you know, both these mobsters were rising stars, but that star eventually will fall. And Paul Volpe's star, he started to get into real estate in Atlantic City and was sort of stepping on the toes of the Philadelphia mob in the late 70s. And he really was making himself a lot of enemies. And Paul Volpe's end came in 1983 when they found his body in the trunk of his BMW left at the long-term parking lot at Toronto Airport. This catapulted John PAI, who became one of the most prominent mob bosses in Canadian history. So I want to start with Montreal, Quebec, because when I talk about geographic territory, this is how vast it is, because the mafia in Montreal for years has owned, has corrupted the waterfront. They have corrupt contacts in the Montreal airport. And these corrupt connections have facilitated all these criminal rackets in organized crime, drug trafficking, smuggling, money laundering. So in 1953, Joseph Joe Bonanno, the head of the family after his own name, took a look because Quebec, the province of Quebec, is very close to New York State. They line up with each other. And he looked at Montreal as a ripe opportunity. So what he did was he sent Carmine Galante from the Bonanno crime family up to Montreal. And they sent Hamilton mobster John PAI up to assist Carmine Galante with setting up Montreal. And what Montreal became for years after that is long considered to be the sixth mafia family in New York, because the Montreal mob in Canada has always been directly correlated with the Bonanno crime family. And if you've heard of the French connection, it's because of this relationship that started back in the early 50s. All the heroin was being brought into Montreal through the Montreal port, where the mob had controlled that area. And all that heroin filtered down from Montreal back into New York and down into the United States. So at the time, the prominent mafia family that was in power in the 1970s in Montreal was the Cotroni crime family. And on the upper top left is Vic Cotroni, he was the boss. To the right, in the right top corner, is Paolo Violi, he was the underboss. And Paolo Violi is going to be important because his sons, decades later, not only grew up in the mafia, but they played a real prominent role in what I'm going to talk about near the end of my presentation. So the Rizzuto crime family ended up overthrowing the Vic Cotroni regime. And the Rizzutos, especially Vito Rizzuto, went on to become the boss of bosses in Canada. Probably one of the most infamous mafia bosses, one of the most charismatic, influential in terms of his underworld influence. So with everything in the mafia, as smooth as things are working, you know, there's eventually going to be a bump in the road, and that power struggle. And this is what happened in the Bonanno crime family. In the upper left-hand corner, Paolo Violi's downfall was he had a gelato store in the streets of Montreal that he owned, and he used that as his place to do business. He would hold court there. Mafiosi in La Cosa Nostra would come and he would conduct his business in his gelato store. One day, he rented out his upper floor apartment to an electrician. Unbeknownst to Paolo Violi, though, that electrician was Bob Maynard, a Montreal undercover police officer. And Maynard was able to live there for a long time in an undercover capacity and install a surreptitious recording devices. And this ended up becoming a public inquiry in the province of Quebec. And it really spelled the end of Paolo Violi because the innermost secrets of the mafia were being played out in the crime commission in the province of Quebec. So he was killed in 1978. And the other infamous photo was Carmine Galante, who had been sent up originally by Joe Bonanno to set up that connection in Montreal, that infamous hit on that patio of that restaurant with the cigar still clenched between his teeth. And at that point in 79, he was the boss of the Bonanno family. So we really saw a shift with Canada and the United States in terms of that Bonanno family connection. So the Rizzuto crime family ended up going on to dominate. And the typical modus operandi in the mafia, no matter where you are, is, they killed Paolo Violi's brother, then they killed Paolo, and then they killed his second brother. And after the three brothers were murdered, the Rizzuto crime family ruled Montreal for the next few decades. And Paolo Violi's wife and two young sons, Dominic and Joey Violi, relocated to Hamilton. And they will become very prominent later in this presentation. So I think everybody has seen or heard of the undercover operation involving Joseph Pistone, the undercover FBI agent, and then the infamous movie Donnie Brasco, which was his undercover moniker. So in 1981, when another internal strife within the Bonanno crime family, on the left is Dominic Sonny Black Napolitano, and on the right was the other capo, Sonny Red Indalicato. And the internal rift came to a head while Joe Pistone was working undercover. And here's where this major Canadian connection comes into play. Because Big Joey Messino was a capo in the Bonanno crime family. And you can see the three capo murders, the three capos who, including Sonny Red, Sonny Black set them up on May 5th, 1981. The three captains were lured to a Brooklyn social club under the ruse, under the guise that Sonny Black was going to extend the olive branch and they were going to fix the conflict within the Bonannos. Well, unbeknownst to them, they were set up for an ambush. Joey Messino was the mastermind. And what Joey did was he brought down three Canadians, including Vito Rizzuto. All three Canadians were from Montreal, Quebec. And I have a little picture here that is really significant because these three Canadians from the Rizzuto family, including Vito Rizzuto, who was one of the shooters, were brought in outside of the country to commit the murders and assist with those three capo murders. This is an amazing picture because this was the day after the three capos hit. And it was a surveillance picture taken outside the Capri Motor Lodge by an FBI agent. And at the time, it really was just another regular surveillance picture that, there's usually hundreds and hundreds. It would come to fruition and be of that much more significance years down the road. And we'll get to that in a second. So Joey Messino, Ligamari, Vito Rizzuto, and Gerlando SCIASCIA. And Gerlando was the direct conduit with the Rizzutos in Montreal to the Bonannos in New York. So let's take a quick step and go to Hamilton, trying to work through this sequentially. Okay, so 1997, we'll start there because that is really where Hamilton was at its peak because there were three Calabrian-based mafia families in the city of Hamilton, Ontario. The Papalia, the Musitano crime family, and the Violi Lapino family. And if you remember Paolo Violi, who was the underboss in Montreal in the 1970s and murdered by the Rizzutos, his two sons with their two uncles became a very powerful Calabrian mafia family in Hamilton. And what's interesting to note is the Rizzuto crime family ended up putting their support behind the Musitanos. So you can imagine the stress and conflict this created between these families in Hamilton. Here are the Musitanos aligning themselves, they are Calabrian, with a Sicilian crime family. But not just that, they're aligning themselves with a crime family that killed Paolo Violi and his two brothers, who were Dominic and Joey's father and two uncles. So what happens next with the power and backing of the incredibly powerful Rizzuto crime family, Pat and Angelo scheme and plot and conspire to whack Johnny Pops Papalia. And the Musitanos never could have done this without the backing of Vito Rizzuto. And when Vito Rizzuto is backing them, you know that this information and probably that permission had to come from New York City because of the connectedness with the Rizzutos and the Bonanno crime family. So here's the conspiracy that was put into play. You have the Musitano brothers hired Ken Murdock. Ken Murdock was an enforcer with the Outlaws motorcycle gang, and he was also an enforcer for the Musitano crime family. And what happened was in 1997, and he was well known on the street, so he was able to get a meeting with Johnny Papalia, and they did a walk and talk down the streets of Hamilton on a nice sunny afternoon, May 31st, 1997. And Murdock lagged behind a couple steps and shot Johnny Papalia in the back of the head, killing him instantly on the sidewalks of Hamilton. And at the time, you know, aside from Vito Rizzuto and Johnny Papalia were the two most powerful mafia bosses in Canada. Carmen Barillero was Johnny Pop's underboss, and he lived in Niagara Falls, Ontario, about 5 minutes from Buffalo, New York. And there's a strategy to that, because he was the conduit to the Buffalo Mafia, the Mogadino crime family. And in July 23rd, about a month and a half after Papalia was murdered, Ken Murdock literally drove down to Niagara Falls, rang the front door of Barilero's large palatial home. Barilero answered the door, and Murdock shot him dead in the doorway. And what happened after that was Johnny Papalia's two brothers wanted nothing to do with, you know, not only exacting revenge, but wanted nothing to do with the mafia. So essentially in 1997, the Papalias were completely finished. And it was interesting because there was a joint forces operation going on looking into the Musitanos. Before these murders, they had a huge lucrative gambling rackets and drug trafficking, and it was called Project Windfall. And the interesting thing was, after Papalia was murdered and after Barilero was murdered, the project was still going. And they had wiretaps and listening devices all over Hamilton and other areas the mob frequented. And there was a 4-day period where Pat Musitano disappeared. And investigators thought one of two things: that he either got whacked for retaliation for killing Johnny Papalia and his underboss, or he disappeared to get his button to become made. Well, the wiretaps picked up Pat's wife on day 5 saying in sort of coded speak, "The eagle has landed." And what happened next with surveillance and some undercover operations essentially confirmed that Pat Musitano had gone to Buffalo and became a made man after killing Johnny and Barilero. Because surveillance took Pat and his cousin, who is Pinot Avignon here in the lower right corner, they followed them to a Toronto restaurant. And 2 undercover operatives posing as a couple went inside the restaurant and were sitting nearby. And they overheard Guy Panapinto, who is up in the upper right corner. He was Vito's conduit in Toronto. And the undercover officers overheard Guy Panapinto saying to Vito, with Pat Musitano and his cousin right there, "These are our friends from Hamilton." And that verbiage, the way that was spoken, that mob language, 100% indicated that Pat was a made man, because when they say our friends, these are friends of ours, it means that they are in that organization as embedded, made mafia men. So that was a very telling situation, and that was in 1997 in Toronto. So things didn't last very long, because Ken Murdock rolled over quicker than an alligator in a swamp, and he became a cooperating witness against the Musitano brothers, Pat and Angelo. And what ended up happening next was the Musitanos were sent to jail. It was a very sparse sentence. They were only charged with conspiracy to commit murder in the Barilero case. So from 2000 to 2006, the brothers were incarcerated. Okay, 2003, Big Joey Messino. If we go back to the 3 Capos hits, when Donnie Brasco was working undercover, Joe Messino was the guy who brought Vito Rizzuto down and the other 2 Canadians to be part of the triple murder. In 2003, Big Joey is now the boss of the Bonanno crime family. And the Bonannos have a history of inner conflict. And this just got worse for Big Joey Messino, because several members of his crime family, including his brother-in-law, Sal Vitale, became cooperating witnesses. So what happened next was, with RICO, all these indictments came out, and the cooperating witnesses were a big part of that catalyst of Joey Messino being on the hot seat. Messino ended up facing 7 murder indictments, including orchestrating the 3 captains' hits in May 5th of 1981. But the one thing that's interesting was at the time in the state of New York, they had the death penalty in 1999. And federal prosecutors separated one of the murder indictments. They call it the standalone charge, and it carried the death penalty. Because what happened was, you can see here in the middle, Joey Messino with Gerlando SCIASCIA, George from Canada. He was one of the 3 Rizzuto members who was involved in the triple murder. In March of 1999, Joe Messino orchestrated the murder of George from Canada. He was found shot to death on the streets in the Bronx of New York. So when these indictments came in 2003, and Big Joey was now the boss of the Bonannos, when he was facing the death penalty, he caved in, and Joey Messino ended up becoming a cooperating witness. And the United States Attorney's Office in New York, with all these American mobsters that they were looking to indict, the one mobster who was their top #1 priority at the very top of their list was mob boss Vito Rizzuto from Montreal, Quebec. And what happened was Bonanno spilled his guts. Not Bonanno, Messino, the boss of the Bonannos. He pointed the finger at Vito Rizzuto as being one of the shooters in the 3 Capos murder. So what happened was in 2007, Rizzuto pled guilty to conspiracy to commit murder and racketeering. And Rizzuto was extradited to the United States and spent time at the very high security prison, the Supermax in Colorado from 2007 to 2012. Now what happened is when you take the most powerful mafia boss in Canada and take him out of the picture, he even said to investigators before he got on the plane right here, he said, with you extraditing me to the United States, blood will spill on the streets of Montreal with me gone. And he couldn't have been more correct, because there was dozens of murders in Montreal, including Vito's father, Vito's son, Vito's brother-in-law, who was kidnapped in the middle of the day, shoved in a van, has never been seen alive again, and several other members of his crime family. So when Vito was released from prison in October of 2012, he had a huge target on his back. And when he came back to Montreal, the first thing he did was he had an inventory list, a mental checklist of who was loyal to his crime family and who wavered and joined the competing faction who was trying to take over the Rizzutos. It was another mafia group in Montreal. And believe it or not, Vito Rizzuto was starting to make a comeback and regain power of the Rizzuto crime family. There were several mob-connected homicides within the first year when Vito came back. The one thing that was really shocking, you can see here the front of the Toronto Sun, death of a Don. A colleague of mine worked Vito Rizzuto. They had surveillance on him 24/7. Nobody, even members of his own crime family, knew that he had cancer. He showed no signs of it at all. And his death from cancer just before Christmas in December of 2013 sent shockwaves and a ripple effect in the Canadian underworld. And the ramifications of his death have created violence all into Ontario and Montreal that is still playing out on the streets of Canada to this very moment. And here's what happened. Vito Rizzuto had backed the Musitano crime family. And when the Musitano brothers took out John Papalia, they had the backing of this powerful group, the Rizzutos. Well, as soon as the Rizzutos were decimated, essentially when they lost Vito, the family just was not the same. They were reduced to almost nothing. And now that the Musitano crime family didn't have that powerful backing of the Rizzutos, Angelo was murdered in 2017. He was shot to death right in his driveway. And Pat Musitano was murdered just this past summer, shot right in the middle of the day in the summer in a parking lot with his 2 bodyguards. And this is really some of what has played out on the streets of Canada. So if we come back to Hamilton, Ontario, those 3 crime families, the Papilias were long gone. With the death of the 2 Musitanos, their father and uncle were the original patriarchs of the Musitano family. The 2 brothers inherited that crime family when the father and uncle died in the 1990s. Now that the brothers were murdered, all we have left in Hamilton anyway was the Violi-Lapino crime family. And we're talking about the Italian Mafia here, traditional organized crime. There are so many other criminal groups that operate, a lot of them in unison with these groups, for the almighty goal of making money. So the Hells Angels have a chapter in Hamilton and a lot of other areas where the Italian Mafia is prominent. I want to finish up and talk about Project OTremens. I was really proud to be a part of this project. It was a project I was a part of right up until I retired in 2017. And Project OTremens ran for 4 years. And it was the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, was the lead on the project, but there was a partnership with the FBI in New York because of that mafia connection. But the epicenter of it was in Hamilton. And this project was pretty unique because it involved a police agent, and it wasn't just any regular agent. And what I want to just sort of give the audience a quick description about is just some of the terms that we use in Canada, the difference between an informant and an agent. So an informant is a confidential human source. They are referenced by an assigned code number, but they are only the eyes and ears on the streets. The police cannot direct them to do something. And an informant is not required to testify in court, and their identity is kept secret with that number. Conversely, an agent is an elevated confidential human source who the police can utilize typically for larger scale organized crime projects. And the difference with an agent is they can be directed by investigators. And an agent, it's a very difficult process to get set up. There's lawyers, there's letters of agreement, there's contracts, there's witness protection. They have to go through psychological assessments. And an agent knows, starting working basically undercover as an agent, that they will have to testify under their actual name when the case is over. So initially, the focus of the project was going to be the Violi-Lapino family and the Musitanos. Joey and Dom in the upper right corner are the 2 sons of Paolo Violi. They were running the Mafia family in Hamilton and had international connections. Rocco and Nat Lapino are brothers, and they are the uncles of Joey and Dom. Their father, years ago, was a major, powerful mobster who emigrated from Italy to Hamilton, and that is how they became rooted in traditional organized crime. What happened with some projects, the Musitanos did not become the focal point. The project centered on the Violi-Lapino crime family, and it was a 4-year project. So just to give you a quick history again, in the upper right here is a picture, a surveillance picture of Paolo Violi, approximately 1977, and he's standing in the doorway of his gelato store in Montreal. And it was above that store where Bob Menard, the Montreal undercover officer, rented out the apartment. And it essentially was very damaging, and it was led to the downfall of Paolo Violi. Now, the 2 Paulo's sons, Joey and Dom, I call it the, repeating the sins, the mafia sins of his father, because what they did, unbeknownst to them during the project, was they allowed another mobster who became the agent to wear a wire and record all their conversations over the course of 4 years. So for witness and confidentiality purposes, the agent has been blocked out. He is currently in witness protection. but I want to give you a little bit of background of who the police agent was. First of all, the police agent was 100% a mobster. He was 100% of Italian heritage. And he grew up in New York City, and he was a street soldier in the Bonanno crime family. And what happened was, about 10 years ago, he served a lengthy prison sentence in the United States. He did his time without ratting or informing on anybody, and he held that omerta, that code of silence, very close to his heart. And when he was released, he was extradited from the United States. He was sent to Italy. He wasn't allowed back in the United States. He wasn't allowed back into Canada. And it was then that he realized he became very disenfranchised with this whole notion of omerta and loyalty, because he was told when he was in jail, we will look after you, we will look after your family. When you get out, we will help you. None of that happened. So he became bitter and completely disenfranchised. And he literally contacted, when he was in Italy, he contacted the RCMP and said, I could be your crystal ball. And this was a very lengthy process because there was so much involved in terms of proving his authenticity, reliability, validity. But after months and months of covert work and meeting and talking with him, they actually put him sort of like a homework assignment to sort of give an indication of how connected he was. And he was so connected to not only the Bonannos in New York, he was connected to the Montreal mob, he was connected to the Buffalo Mafia, and he grew up very close with Dominic and Joey Violi in Hamilton. So next thing you know, he has become the undercover police agent. So he's a mobster, but he's wearing a wire and he's working for the RCMP. And it's very difficult. I'm going to try to do my best. I've created some highlights of Project OTremens because it was 4 years of the police agent who was the mobster working undercover, international connections, drug importation. There was so many things that happened. So let's talk about, I want to relay some of the really exciting things that I was very fortunate to be a part of. So Project OTremens involved 319 undercover operations. And in police agent investigations in Canada, I like to use the analogy of, the handling team who handles the agent. There's surveillance teams, there's all kinds of different types of investigators. And it's almost like each undercover operation was like the scene of a Martin Scorsese movie. Operational plans were written, almost like a script, that this is what the agent was going to do, this is where they were going to meet, whether it was to buy a gun, whether it was to buy drugs. And there was 319 undercover operations over the span of 4 years. As well, there were 25 Part 6 authorizations. And in Canada, Part 6, they call them Part 6, it's basically getting authorization from a judge to install listening devices in various areas. So one of the things I'm very proud of to have been part of this project was it kind of made a bit of history. It did. On November 21st, 2015, the agent knew a few days ahead of time that members from the Bonanno crime family in New York, and I want to take a step back, the police agent lived in Hamilton for the entire duration of the project. He would go back and forth to New York, but he was in Hamilton and he was very close with the Violi Lupinos. But he kind of was that conduit with New York, Montreal, Buffalo, and the Violi Lupinos in Hamilton. So the amazing thing was we were able to, the project team, get notice that members from the Bonanno crime family were going to come up to Hamilton, Ontario, and they were going to induct our police agent as a made man in the Bonanno crime family. So it gave the investigative team the advantage of getting into a hotel room and hooking up that room with video and sound. So on November 21st, 2015, 2 members from New York City drove up to Hamilton, which is about a 9-hour drive. They came into the hotel room, and the police agent on video with sound was officially inducted into the BONANNO crime family. And you know, your typical, the mob's huge on symbolism and tradition. You know, it didn't involve the pricking of the trigger finger and the blood smearing on the card, the saint, and then burning that card in the hands. But nonetheless, it was a very significant event because the agent, no one knew, obviously he was working as with the RCMP. So it really changed not only the direction of the project, but after the agent became a made man, Dominic Violi particularly warmed up to him that much more because he was now an official made member. And this is a still photograph of the hotel room. You can see the TV's on. It was turned up very loud. And the two mobsters are here. It's a little blurred out because of the police agent's identity. But Zumo, who was the acting captain of the Bonannos, said, from this day forward, you're a member of the Bonanno family. Congratulations. Here's just another couple quotes. The transcript was fairly long, so I picked some of the highlights out of it. So Damiano Zumo continues during the induction ceremony. The reason why we're here is from this day forward, you're going to be an official member of the Bonanno family. And the agent says, thank you. And on the next slide, you can see here, his back is to the TV. That is Zumo. He has his left hand on the right shoulder of the police agent. And he says to him, it's already from this guy, everybody approved it. You're going to be in our regime. You only answer now to the Bonanno family. And the agent says, okay. And that was really significant because what happened next, and this actually happened towards the end of the project, and this is something that's never happened in the history of not only the Canadian Mafia, but the history of the American mob. And Dom Violi was promoted to underboss of the Buffalo Mafia. And gone are the days where it was the Magadinos. It was now the Joseph Todaro crime family, who are still active in Buffalo, New York to this day. And this was really significant too. And even the prosecutor in Toronto, who was one of the main prosecutors on this case, Dom Violi trusted the police agent. He wasn't, this wasn't bravado, he wasn't bragging. He's old school mafiosi. Dom Violi had gone down to Florida. And when he came back, he had a one-on-one with the police agent. What Dom Violi didn't know was the agent was wired for sound. And this is just part of the intercept that was captured. Dom Violi says to the police agent, they made me number 2, underboss of the, and the agent interjects, of the whole thing. And Violi says the whole thing. And the agent says, congratulations, Dom, you made history. And it really was, because there were 30 other candidates, all American mobsters, who were overlooked. Joe Todaro promoted Dom Violi to underboss of the Buffalo, New York mob family. So that was a really significant event as well during the project. And it was really fun. The agent, with his thick Brooklyn accent, he would have to explain, because in a lot of the wiretaps, you would only obviously hear, unless the surveillance had an eye on him meeting somebody or doing a hand-to-hand or a drug or a gun buy. But a lot of the conversations, we had to rely on listening to the audio after. And Joe Todaro's name was never uttered. It was never spoken. The Violi brothers would always touch their nose when they were talking about Joe Todaro. So there were a lot of things the agent was helpful in the debrief part after a certain undercover operation. He would tell the investigators with the RCMP that he was talking about Joe Todaro, because anytime he's touched his nose, everybody knew they were talking about the boss of Buffalo, Joe Todaro. And another interesting thing, the mob code, especially when you're just hearing the transcript, had this project gone on a little bit longer, there's no doubt in my mind and the investigative team that there would have been a conspiracy to commit a murder in the United States. because now that Dominic Violi was the underboss of the Buffalo mob, they had to prove themselves, because I can only imagine all the other mobsters who were overlooked probably were like, who is this Canadian guy that is the underboss of Buffalo? What, he's going to run this family from Hamilton? So Joey Violi was talking a lot, very coded speak. You wouldn't think, listening to the tape, that he was talking about murder, but the agent afterwards would say, when he was saying those words, he was making the sign of a gun. You know, we have to go down and do some work, or something along those lines. And he was holding up the sign of a gun. So there's no doubt that they were going to go down and kill, carry out a couple mob contracts at the behest of the Buffalo family, just to give them some street credibility, not only in Buffalo, but in the United States in general, especially New York City, with the Mafia Commission and the 5 families. So the takedowns were in November of 2017. There were several mob-connected arrests in Canada. There were several mob arrests in New York City. And the biggest thing that they were doing was drug trafficking, gambling, all the typical criminal rackets. But these are just some other quick highlights that I want to finish and get it in on time. The mafia is very successful at corrupting people. And there was a civilian employee with the Toronto Police Service who had been corrupted by this group. And she was running different names and license plates. There was also at one point in the wiretap communications, Joey Violi was talking about a judge they had on their payroll. Unfortunately, the investigation, which was very in-depth and detailed, that information could never be verified and proven. But the civilian employee with the Toronto Police was charged. This project it really showed the international scope of the Violi-Lapino family on an international level with drug trafficking. As well overlap. They dealt with Asian organized crime, Eastern European organized crime, outlaw motorcycle gangs. They were talking about contract work in the USA. The Violi brothers even had plans for Montreal, Quebec, where their dad used to be the underboss, because the Rizzuto crime family was gone. But what it really showed was how, I call it the mafia square, how well connected Montreal, Hamilton, Buffalo, and New York were. The police agent was connected to all the mafia families in those areas, but the project really showed that connectivity with the mafia still in Buffalo and New York, especially with Dom getting bumped to underboss. So this is just a quick picture just showing the connectivity. CFSEU is just an investigative term with the RCMP that I was a part of, the Combined Forces Special Enforcement Unit. And there's 12 search warrants. There were 30 different police agencies, all kinds of fentanyl. These are the very highly potent, very dangerous drugs that are really leading to a lot of these overdoses and an opioid crisis in Canada before COVID hit. And it's really directly attributed to drugs like fentanyl and carfentanil being on the streets. So in 2018, the Violi brothers they pled guilty. The criminal organization charges didn't come to fruition, which is kind of the equivalent of RICO. But Don was given 8 years and Joey was given 16. Joey got a longer sentence because he was the guy that was kind of on the streets, more involved in drug trafficking. So it was a mitigating factor at his sentencing. Interestingly enough, their 2 uncles, Nat and Rocco Lapino, escaped charges. And the reason being, they were so old school. Nat Lapino on the left here was always doing walk and talks. And there were even various points in the project where he would say to the Violis, or he kind of kept his distance from the agent. And he would always say, do you ever notice, the heat's a little bit on, or the heat's around when the agent's around? And everybody shrugged it off. But, Nat Lapino, old school mobster, he was a made man in the Buffalo mob. His intuition was spot on. So they would do walk and talks, but Joey Violi would do walk and talks, but he would do them with the agent, and the agent was recording them the whole time. So that's the uncles just we couldn't get evidence on the uncles. So I'm just a couple minutes before wrapping up. I just wanted to read a quote. This is the acting United States Attorney for New York. She said, the recording of a secret induction ceremony is an extraordinary achievement for law enforcement and deals a significant blow to La Cosa Nostra. The RCMP said Project OTremens directly infiltrated the highest levels of traditional organized crime operating in the area. We had an opportunity to infiltrate some higher echelon traditional organized crime groups because of the cooperation of someone who is respected by traditional organized crime in both countries, and that was the police agent. And literally a month after the Violi brothers were sentenced, this is the aftermath of Project OTremens. In 2019, Cheche Lapino, who is the son of one of their the uncles, Rocco Lapino, and he's the first cousin of Dom and Joey. This is surveillance footage captured from the outside of his home. Cheche Lapino had nothing to do with the mafia. We even proved it with the wiretaps, with the uncles talking. But this gunman, who investigators believe was probably hired by Montreal, probably from a street level based gang, to come down and do the hit. The case is unsolved. But Cheche walked in his garage and the hitman followed him. You can see he has his right hand in his pocket on a gun, and seconds later, he murdered Cheche. There's been a lot of unrest in Southern Ontario, in Hamilton, since the Violis have been jailed, since the Musitanos have been killed, and since the Vito Rizzuto. It is one huge power vacuum. So really quickly, before I conclude, the Italian Mafia is very prominent in Canada, but so are other organizations. Hell's Angels, the outlaw motorcycle gang, El Chapo, before he was sent to jail in New York last year, his Sinaloa cartel was operating extremely frequently into Canada with cocaine, parachutes, GPS controlled. El Chapo had very good connectivity with the Hells Angels in Canada, who acted as the cartel's muscle and would commit murders at the behest of them if need be. I'm not going to have time to talk about Toronto, but there are 5 major prominent Ndrangheta Calabrian-based families operating as we speak in Toronto. And they are directly tied to the main area of the Ndrangheta in Calabria, Italy. And the Calabrians, they call it the Saderno group, they have cells all over the world, including Australia, other areas. But Toronto is one of their biggest hubs of organized crime with the Saderno group. And in the last 4 years, there's been dozens of homicides, fire bombings, drive-by shootings, all in the Toronto area. And the majority of it is due to the vast amounts of money that the gambling rackets online and in cafes are generating for the mob. I'm just gonna finish quickly. This is just a picture of me working Project OTremens, the men and women involved in that project 4 years. It's just, I'm very honored to have been a small part of something big in Canada and in New York City. And really quickly, I just came out with a new book called Undercover. It deals with firsthand interviews I did with various undercover operators, not only in Canada, but in the United States. And if you want more information about that and myself, my official webpage is underworldstories.com. And it was really, truly an honor and a privilege to be asked to speak today at the Mob Museum. I want to thank you very much. And if anybody has any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them.
Stephen Metelsky. Is this on? Okay, yes. Stephen Metelsky, a criminal psychology professor at Mohawk College, a retired police sergeant. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. Is there anyone in here that would like to ask a question? You can come right up here and speak in this mic.
Can you hear me? Okay.
I can hear you a little bit. The audio is a little sketchy. Go ahead, though.
Okay. Just curious what that the Project OTremens, is that an acronym for something? Or how did you come up with the Project OTremens name?
Oh, the name. OTremens? Yeah, the RCMP, I never actually found out the root of that. Sometimes the project name, what the RCMP typically does is they come up with a name that has absolutely nothing to do with the group that is they're enforcing. Tremens is they always put an O in front of a word. It's one of the greatest mysteries with the RCMP because there's sometimes no rhyme or reason to a project name. I don't even know how they came up with that name.
Are there any other questions here in the courtroom? Stephen, we did have a question online. Someone said, what is the biggest difference between the Canadian Mafia compared to the United States?
The biggest difference?
Yes.
Do you know, they are all in the Mafia. The only difference between them is where they are geographically located. Because the Mafia in Canada has been historically and still presently the connectivity. You know, a lot of things that happen in Canada, they still have to get permission from the Americans. Like when I talked about Johnny Pops Papalia and Vito Rizzuto, the boss of bosses in Montreal, backing the Musitanos. You know, that permission, because the Rizzutos in Montreal are connected to the Bonannos in New York. And the Mafia in Hamilton is connected to the Mafia in Buffalo. So the only difference, they're all committing the same types of crimes. The only difference is the groups that are operating north of the American border are in Canada, obviously. But the connectivity is there. The only difference is they're operating up here and the American Mafia obviously is operating down there. That whole connectivity, when I talked about OTremens really showing, and this is up until 4 years ago and it's still present today, how deeply embedded Montreal, Hamilton are with Buffalo, New York and New York City. So the only difference is they'd be dealing with Canadian dollars and the mob south of the border would be dealing in American currency. Other than that, they're all in this underworld together.
I have a question for you. When your agent came back from Europe, how did you guys swing that? Something about customs and border protection and passports and all that. How long did it take to get him from this extradited banned status back through into freedom to travel back and forth between Hamilton and Buffalo?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I wasn't part of that process, but I am privy to the information that it was months and months and months because there were so many legalities. And in Canada, when you look at somebody like this police agent, obviously being extradited to Italy and not allowed in the country, you know, we're talking about the upper echelon of the RCMP, the upper echelon of the FBI, working together, two governments, two countries. Once the RCMP was able to, you know, like any informant, an informant can say anything. And that information is only as valuable as the investigators can corroborate it. So after months and months and months with the RCMP working back and forth, there were, I could say there were secretive meetings in a neutral third. I'm not even privy to where these meetings happened. But they essentially, obviously there's a lot of closed door meetings, a lot of secretive meetings, but they were able to get the police agent back up here because of his potential value. And in that homework phase that the RCMP gave the agent, once they were able to sit back and corroborate and realize this guy is the real deal. This guy grew up in the mob. He's a Bonanno street soldier. And he was so connected to the mob, not only in the United States, but in Canada. So this took months and months because, you know, he's in a witness protection program. This just doesn't happen overnight. And that process took a long time. So I can only imagine the sort of political red tape, not only the Canadians, but even the American government, some of those strings, they would have had to convince, putting forward that pitch that by doing A, B, and C, this is what we feel we can get in terms of prosecuting the mafia down the road. And that's, with anything. And, I'm a former undercover operator as well. Things like passports and ID, that all becomes part of the agent process where they are, given all those legitimate documents. And, there's a bit of a backstory to, he would have had to explain how he got back. And, that was all built into his reentry to Canada.
Very cool. Back in the 70s, I used to go to Camiso's restaurant in Toronto, and there were always limousines parked outside. Are they still operating out of that restaurant in the northwest part of Toronto?
I'm sorry, I couldn't understand the beginning of that. I apologize.
I said back in the 70s, I used to eat at Camiso's restaurant, and there were always the black limousines parked outside. The rumor in those days was that Camiso's, that was where the mob ran their business from. Is it still being run out of the same restaurant? Any idea?
That part I don't know, but what I can say about the Camiso's is the funny thing with the mafia in Canada is, a lot of these generations, you have just like the Violis. Some of the elder Camisos have died. There's still some of the older Camisos, but they are a very powerful mafia family in Toronto. They are part of that Soderno group. So there's no doubt in my mind, I've been out of the intelligence organized crime game for going on 5 years. So, I'm kind of outside looking in, but I can tell you 100%, these groups are alive and well in Toronto. And it's interesting with these being dragged in Toronto, because gone are the days where, it used all these groups, whether it was outlaw motorcycle gangs, Asian organized crime, European groups, they decades ago worked on their own. But what I like to liken it to is, they all speak one universal language, and that's cash. So especially in Canada, we're seeing more and more and more over the last couple of decades, these groups working with all these other groups, Mexican cartel, all these groups, because they realize everybody has something to offer. And when you look at drug importation and trafficking, Montreal is still a huge hub with the waterfront, with groups owning trucking companies. So those 5 mafia families in Toronto, including the Camisos, are very, very active as we speak. There's been a lot of turmoil, but have they overlapped with Montreal and Hamilton? They have a little bit here and there over the years, but I would say Toronto right now, Hamilton and Montreal are really it's almost like the next chapter is to be written. There's a huge void in those areas. When the Violi brothers get out of jail, which will probably be sooner than later, it will be interesting to see what's going to develop in Hamilton, Toronto, and Montreal. But in the meantime, you have these 5 major families in Toronto. And, drug trafficking has always been huge. But when you look at drug trafficking versus gambling, the laws in Canada are a little bit more lackadaisical than they are in the United States. And that's the reason why these groups come to Canada, because they know that. And, groups like the Camisos, all the cafes with the gaming, and these are where all the crimes are and the scheming. The big thing now in Canada is the online gambling. It's making them millions of dollars a day, even with COVID. We have the only sport that didn't come back was the Canadian Football League. You have every other sport that's back, and they're making millions and millions of dollars. And with the amount of money the Canadian mafia, especially in Toronto, are making with gambling, in the last 3-4 years, there's been some significant projects that have been done. Some of them in tandem with the authorities in Italy, because that's where these 5 families, Toronto is one of their major cells from Calabria, Italy. And, anytime I always say in the legitimate world, when there's a takeover or a merger, it happens. But in the mob, when groups are trying to take over someone's territory or a criminal racket. You know, it's just fraught with murder and violence. And those 5 families, we're seeing that right now as we speak.
Thanks very much.
You're welcome.
Stephen, thank you again. And you do have a book coming out shortly, correct?
I'm sorry?
You do have a book coming out soon as well, right?
Actually, it came out about a month ago. I'm very, very proud of it. It's called Undercover. And I interviewed several undercover operatives in the United States and undercover operatives in Canada. And there's more information about it. My official webpage for the book and some of the other things I work on in terms of writing is at underworldstories.com. Thank you for bringing that up. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you so much.
In the south of you, I'd love to gain complete control of you.